So hi everyone, thank you all so much for coming to listen to me talk about one of my absolute favourite places. So I'm going to be spending the next 40 minutes or so firstly convincing you that Ethiopia is awesome, and secondly talking about whether we can protect nature without harming people, particularly in places where people depend on land for food and livelihoods. So I feel hugely fortunate that after finishing my master's here at DICE in 2022, my first job was as a research assistant at Kew Gardens. And that led me to spending the last 4 years regularly visiting Ethiopia, where I've been working with some incredible people and learning what an amazing place it is. So I wanted to start off with the people and partnerships that have shaped the work that I'm going to be talking about today. This wasn't a project that I did or could have done alone. It was built on long-standing partnerships between Kew and multiple Ethiopian institutions, including the Ethiopian Wildlife Conservation Authority, Addis Ababa University, and the Ethiopian Biodiversity Institute. There we go. I'm especially grateful to my colleagues Gebra Meskel, Wendewek, Bezawit, Asamanu, and James, who I've been lucky enough to spend hundreds of hours traveling around Ethiopia with. And it's these journeys, the conversations that we've had along the way, and the experiences that we've had that have really shaped how I've understood Ethiopia's landscapes, its protected areas, and the challenges that I'm going to be talking about today. So before I get into the talk, I wanted to take you on a quick drive through Ethiopia. So most of the journeys start in the capital of Addis Ababa, which has around 6 million residents, and it's the heart of the African Union, filled with bustling markets, high-rise buildings, and beautiful parks. It sits at 2,300 meters above sea level, making it one of the highest capital cities in the world. Then when you leave Addis, I'm always struck by how quickly the landscapes change. You travel through expansive cereal farming landscapes where you see crops like wheat, sorghum, and teff. Teff is an indigenous Ethiopian grain. It's actually named after the Amharic word for lost because the grains are so small that if you dropped them, you wouldn't find them again. Teff is one of Ethiopia's most important crops as it's used to make injera, the fermented flatbread that's central to Ethiopian food. Carrying on, you pass through the dramatic scenery of the Ethiopian highlands. Ethiopia is sometimes called the roof of Africa, and that's because it has the largest amount of land above 3,000 meters on the continent. And this is also where many of Ethiopia's rivers begin, including the Blue Nile. As with most journeys in Ethiopia, you're likely to come across something completely unexpected, such as turning the corner and seeing 40 vultures by the roadside, which is a pretty cool sight, especially as populations of vultures in Africa have been declining dramatically. Carrying on, the landscape then opens out into vast savannas and grasslands. And these are much drier and more open landscapes, but they're home to some really unique wildlife, such as Swain's hartebeest, which is an endangered antelope found only in Ethiopia. You also pass lots of grazing sites. There's livestock everywhere, and Ethiopia actually has the highest livestock population on the continent. So there's tens of millions of cattle, sheep, goats, and camels. And pastoralism is central to the livelihoods of many people. Further south, you're met by the amazing smell of roasting coffee, and you enter dense forests such as Kaffa. Kaffa forest is the center of origin and diversity of wild Arabica coffee. And everyone you meet here knows the story of Khalid the goat herder, who first discovered coffee after noticing that his goats became quite excited after eating some strange red berries. These dense coffee forests are also important for many vulnerable species, such as lions. Then continuing on, you reach the incredible farming landscapes of southwest Ethiopia. And these feel really different from the cereal landscapes that we passed through earlier. And here farming is much more diverse. You see coffee, fruit trees, tubers, and spices all woven together in home gardens. And one of the amazing things about Ethiopia is that while there are many introduced and commercialized crops, the traditional crops continue to be an important part of the national food system. And one of these crops, which I can't give a talk about Ethiopia without mentioning, is enset. Enset is an amazing crop that most people have never heard of, and that's because it's only ever been domesticated in Ethiopia. It's a drought-resistant starch staple that's often referred to as the tree against hunger, and it supports the food security of nearly 20 million people in Ethiopia. You might think it looks quite like a banana, which is right because it's a relative of the banana, but actually you don't eat the fruit, it's every other part of the plant that's used. So the pseudostem and underground corm are used to make food, the midrib is used as fodder for cattle, the fiber that's extracted is used to make rope, and the leaves are used for wrapping and baking bread. I could go on with that list for a really long time. I think we're stuck. So that brings me on to the amazing variety of food. So having now visited Ethiopia about 8 times, you would think I'd tried all of the common foods that they have. But every trip, I'm given something that I've never seen before, and I'm told that it's really common. The bread that you can see on the right is kocho, which is the bread that's made from enset, and it's usually eaten with cabbage and milk, or on special occasions, raw beef mince called kitfo. For me, traveling through Ethiopia makes the question about how we do conservation feel very real. These landscapes are extraordinary for nature, but they're also places where people grow food, graze livestock, and build livelihoods. So with that, I want to move on to the main talk, which I'm going to structure around 4 questions. So firstly, why does the world want to protect more nature, and what ways do we have of doing this? Secondly, why is Ethiopia such an important and challenging place to think about this? Third, are Ethiopia's protected areas working for both nature and people? And finally, what happens next? If countries are being asked to protect more land, how can that be done in a way that works for both nature and people? So first up, why protect more nature? As I'm sure everyone in this room will be aware, around the world, nature is in trouble. Species are declining, habitats are being converted, and globally, we need to act now if we're going to bend the curve of biodiversity loss. Ecosystems around the world are under pressure from agricultural expansion, urbanization, climate change, and many other factors. And this isn't only bad for nature itself, but also for the many ecosystem services that it provides that enable us to live. Things like clean water and air, climate regulation, fertile soils, pollination, food production, and many others. So there's a very real need for us to protect nature. So in 2022, governments around the world agreed on a new global biodiversity framework with the aim of halting and reversing global biodiversity loss. 196 parties have ratified this framework and agreed to progress towards meeting its 22 targets. One of the most well-known parts of this plan is the target to conserve 30% of land and sea by 2030, often called 30 by 30. And this target is important because it creates a shared ambition to make more space for nature globally. And protected areas are one of the main tools for doing this. So sites such as national parks, wildlife reserves, biosphere reserves, and many other types of conservation area can all help towards safeguarding species and ecosystems from threats. Globally, we currently have around 18% of terrestrial land in protected and conserved areas, so that's still a fair way off from meeting the 30% area target. But protecting more land to reach 30 by 30 isn't as easy as simply designating more places as protected. Often, the same land is important for many different things. For example, it might support rare species and ecosystems, but it might also be needed for food production, local livelihoods, or development. So when establishing protected areas, we aren't talking about empty places on a map, but talking about places that are already important to people in many different ways. And that's why the 30 by 30 target isn't just about area. The target also highlights the need for protected areas to be representative, meaning that they protect the full spectrum of species and ecosystems. Effective, meaning they actually work to provide tangible conservation benefits. And equitable, meaning they respect the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities and ensure that the people living closest to them are not negatively impacted. So globally, success in meeting the 30 by 30 target depends on what is protected, how protected areas are managed to effectively reduce the pressures on nature, and what the impacts are for the people living around these protected landscapes. And while these targets are set globally, they're being implemented at national scales under a wide variety of different contexts. So why are we talking about Ethiopia? Firstly, as you'll have seen from the drive-through earlier, Ethiopia's landscapes are extraordinary, and they're also globally important. Ethiopia is overlapped by two of the world's 35 global biodiversity hotspots, the Eastern Afro-Montane and the Horn of Africa. And it's home to many species that are found nowhere else. It actually has the second highest rate of plant endemism on the continent after South Africa. So, for example, this is the Ethiopian giant lobelia. When it flowers, it can reach up to 10 meters tall, and it's adapted to Ethiopia's cold Afro-alpine habitats. So with climate change, its suitable habitat is expected to shrink, making it highly vulnerable. Ethiopia actually has the largest continuous area of Afro-alpine habitat. This habitat also supports the Ethiopian wolf. This is the rarest canid in the world, and we were really lucky to spot this one on the last day of our trip in January. Having been scanning the horizon for a glimpse of it through binoculars, we looked down and this one was about 20 meters from us. So Ethiopia's biodiversity is not only beautiful, it's also globally significant and incredibly vulnerable. Adding to that, Ethiopia isn't just a wild biodiversity hotspot. It's also an agro-biodiversity hotspot and one of the 8 global centers of crop origin and domestication, which are shown in grey on the map. And that means it holds important reservoirs of crop genetic diversity that could allow us to adapt our global food systems to changing conditions in the future. And the reason that is important is because despite around 30,000 food plants that historically, as humans, we've eaten, today 60% of global calorific intake comes from just rice, wheat, and maize. So that makes our global food system incredibly vulnerable to shocks, and essentially we're putting all of our eggs in one basket. So if something wipes out one of our major food crop varieties, it's likely places like Ethiopia that we'll be turning to find new varieties. Ethiopia's landscapes are also central to people's food and livelihoods. Ethiopia is the second most populous country in Africa, with more than 80 ethnic groups and languages. It also has the highest livestock population on the continent, and around 80% of people depend on agriculture for their livelihoods. So it makes it a really powerful place to think about whether conservation can work for both nature and people. Ethiopia also faces many challenges, particularly around food insecurity and poverty. It ranks 102nd out of 127 countries on the Global Hunger Index, and it's historically been one of the largest recipients of targeted food aid. So when we talk about protecting land in Ethiopia, we're talking about these decisions being made in a context where food security and poverty are very real and urgent issues. And really, without first meeting basic needs and ensuring people have enough food and are not living in poverty, conservation isn't going to be the priority. But despite all of these challenges and the competing land use needs in Ethiopia, Ethiopia has been steadily expanding its protected area network with the aim of conserving its amazing biodiversity. And that brings us on to the next question of, are Ethiopia's protected areas working? This map shows Ethiopia's current protected area network, which covers 9.4% of its land area. So Ethiopia is still a long way off from that 30% target. But before asking whether we should protect more land, we first need to ask how the existing protected areas are doing. Are they representing the full spectrum of Ethiopia's biodiversity? Are they helping to reduce threats and conserve nature? And what are the consequences for people that are living nearby? We'll start with what Ethiopia's protected areas are actually protecting. So this is a map of Ethiopia's ecoregions, and the graph shows the proportion of each ecoregion's extent in Ethiopia that is protected. And you can see that representation is really varied across the ecoregions, from 0% in the Horn of Africa xeric bushlands to 43% in the Saharan flooded grasslands. And that doesn't look great in comparison to the 17% Aichi target, which was meant to be met in 2020, or the 30% global biodiversity framework target. But if we instead compare to 9.4%, which is Ethiopia's current protected area coverage, things look a bit better, and 6 of the 11 ecoregions are currently well represented. We also looked at how well Ethiopia's species were represented. This graph shows the proportion of each species range in Ethiopia that's protected. And for reptiles, mammals, and birds, threatened status on the IUCN Red List was associated with greater representation in the protected areas. And that's really positive because it suggests that the protected areas are in important places for the species most in need of conservation action. However, plants differed from this, with lower representation of threatened compared to non-threatened plants. And that's concerning because of the high rates of plant endemism in Ethiopia. But regardless of what is found inside the protected areas of Ethiopia, it only really matters if the protected areas are actually working to conserve it. And when we talk to different stakeholders working in protected areas around Ethiopia, we were often told that the protected areas are not working. We were told that agriculture, which is one of the biggest drivers of biodiversity loss, is expanding into protected areas, that forests are being degraded, that timber products are being illegally harvested, and that there's increasing pressure from growing populations and land use change. And in many places, we could see real examples of that happening. So the first photo here was taken in Chebara Chachura National Park, which is one of the last remaining suitable places for elephants in Ethiopia. And if you look really close, you can actually see a few on the tree line in the middle. But you can also see the degradation on the hillside. The second photo is from Bale Mountains National Park, and that's one of the last remaining places for the Ethiopian wolf. And again, you can see that agriculture is expanding up the slopes. So while the basic goal of a protected area is to conserve biodiversity by reducing pressures that drive degradation, like agricultural expansion or unsustainable resource use, seeing some degradation inside protected areas doesn't automatically mean that the protected area failed. So to explain what I mean, today I walked up from the station in the pouring rain and I had an umbrella. But despite the point of the umbrella being to keep me dry, I still got wet. So I could assume that the umbrellas failed. But I can only find out the true impact of the umbrella if I compared it to how wet I would have got without it. So if someone had been walking up next to me without an umbrella at the same time and they got a lot wetter than me, then I could say the umbrella was having a positive impact. And we can think about protected area impacts in the same way. So a protected area might lose forest or undergo degradation, but it doesn't automatically mean that the protection failed. The important question is, would things have been worse without protection? So rather than just analysing whether change happened inside protected areas, we need to compare those changes to what would have happened in the same place if it hadn't been protected. So in other words, we need to estimate and compare to the counterfactual scenario. And to estimate this fairly, we need to control for all of the other factors that might influence whether an area loses forest or experiences agricultural expansion. So we match places that are as similar as possible. Similar climate, elevation, access to cities, agricultural suitability, population density, land cover type, etc., etc. And the aim of this analysis is to make sure that the only difference between the areas we're comparing is that one is protected and the other one isn't. And that way we can be more sure that any differences that we find are caused by the protected area. So for example, if a matched non-protected place lost more forest than a protected place, we can say that the protected area is still having a positive impact. So on to the results. Aligning with what stakeholders had said and what we'd seen on the ground, Ethiopia's protected area network was losing forest and was experiencing agricultural encroachment. So if we only looked at what happened inside the protected areas, it would be easy to say that they weren't working, as ideally the protected areas would prevent both of these things from happening. But when we compared to what would have likely happened if that protection hadn't been put in place, we found that Ethiopia's protected areas were significantly reducing forest cover loss and agricultural expansion. This is a major success, and it's especially impressive given the extreme pressures Ethiopia's landscapes are under and the limited resources that they have available for conservation. So Ethiopia's protected area network is delivering real benefits for nature. And this matters both nationally and globally because of the many important ecosystem services that its unique biodiversity provides. But while Ethiopia is trying to conserve its globally important biodiversity, it's also working to address more immediate challenges such as improving food security and reducing poverty. So progress towards effective protected areas for nature may compete with these other priorities, as protected areas often put restrictions on land use. For example, in many of Ethiopia's protected areas, people are restricted from expanding their agriculture, grazing their livestock, or harvesting things from the forest. So we also wanted to assess how these areas were affecting the people that lived closest to them. And to do that, we used the same method as before to compare changes among similar households close to and further away from protected areas. And for this, we made use of a national household panel survey, which resurveyed 3,699 households, so we were able to measure changes occurring in the same household over time. And unfortunately, we found that people living close to protected areas experienced significantly greater declines in food security than similar households elsewhere. They also experienced declines in material well-being, which is essentially a proxy for wealth determined by the number of assets a household owns. So to put that food security result into context, households near protected areas lost on average just over a month of adequate food over 5 years, while similar households further away remained roughly the same. So if you imagine two households in a similar position, both of them have enough food for all 12 months of the year. But 5 years later, one household still has enough food for the full year, while the other experiences a month without enough food to feed their families. And this isn't just a few households. There's around 3.2 million people living within 10 kilometers of Ethiopia's protected area network. So what might seem like small household level changes can add up to substantial social costs. And that brings us back to the question of, can we conserve nature without harming people? Protected areas in Ethiopia are delivering real benefits for nature, but those benefits are not free. Costs are being felt by the people living closest to them. And without addressing this major trade-off, conservation is both unethical and unlikely to be sustainable long-term. So what happens next? As I mentioned earlier, Ethiopia's current protected area network covers about 9% of the country's land area. The target is 30%. So reaching the area-based component of the target would mean more than tripling the current protected area extent. And if that challenge wasn't big enough, It's made greater by the fact that many places currently underrepresented in the network overlap with places that have more agricultural land and more people. In other words, future expansion may involve places where land is already more heavily used and more important for livelihoods. So expansion could exacerbate the existing trade-offs if it's not carefully planned and properly supported. A good example is the Ethiopian montane grasslands and woodlands. So that's shown in the lighter green on the map, and it's severely underrepresented in the current protected area network. It's less than 3% of its area that's currently protected. And this ecoregion provides important habitat for many of Ethiopia's endemic highland species, but it's also one of the most agriculturally productive parts of the country. So expanding protection here would mean protecting landscapes that are already important for farming, grazing, and livelihoods. So it would likely come with very high opportunity costs. Given the major trade-offs that are occurring, expanding the network is not a top priority in Ethiopia. Stakeholders were clear that the first priority is making the existing network better. And I think that's really important because from a global perspective, if a country is currently at 9% and the target is 30%, it's very tempting to say that the priority must be expansion. But from a national perspective, when the existing protected area network is already under pressure and already linked to local costs, it makes much more sense to focus on making the current system more effective, better supported, and fairer. So how do we improve the existing protected area network? Top suggestions from stakeholders were to increase engagement with local communities, to work to address land use conflict, and to build partnerships that allow support for both conservation and livelihoods. We can also learn from win-wins. So while Ethiopia's protected area network as a whole showed major trade-offs, we also analysed protected areas individually, and we found a handful that showed win-win outcomes, so better outcomes for both nature and people. One example of this is Yayu Coffee Forest Biosphere Reserve. Yayu is interesting because people's livelihoods are closely tied to the forest itself. So households earn income from forest coffee and other non-timber forest products. So keeping the forest standing is not only beneficial for biodiversity, but also for people's livelihoods. There are also many projects working in this area to help improve livelihoods and ensure sustainable resource use. Some of you may have even bought Yayu wild forest coffee here in the UK, and if you haven't, I'd definitely recommend. And looking at places that are win-wins like Yayu is really useful because it shows what a more positive pathway could look like, where conservation is linked to livelihoods and is backed by funding, partnerships, and practical support. It doesn't mean that every protected area in Ethiopia could copy Yayu exactly, because the local context matters, and any funding or support needs to be carefully aligned with local livelihoods. But it does show that better outcomes are possible. Looking more broadly at patterns across protected areas, we found that higher budgets tended to be associated with better performance for environmental outcomes, but we didn't find the same relationship between protected area budgets and well-being outcomes. And that makes sense because currently protected area budgets are directed towards staff, patrols, monitoring, equipment, and basically anything to build the capacity to reduce pressure on nature. But the budgets aren't directed towards working with local communities to improve livelihoods. And this is probably because authorities in charge of the protected areas don't have the mandate to work on issues beyond conservation. And this is a problem that's common all over the world, where conservation, agriculture, and development sectors are often siloed from one another. So if we want to protect nature without harming people, we need greater capacity to work with local communities. And that can be done through strategic partnerships across sectors and targeted funding and support. With that, I just wanted to highlight that everything I've spoken about so far has recently been published in Nature, Ecology and Evolution. And there's also an amazing News and Views article written by Joanna Eklund, which takes kind of a zoomed out view from the Ethiopian specifics to look at how what the work means for progressing towards 30 by 30 more broadly. I'll leave QR codes up on the final slide. But before I finish, I wanted to quickly highlight 2 other projects that we have ongoing in Ethiopia at the moment. And the first one looks nationally at how we can think about starting to reduce these trade-offs by using multi-objective spatial planning to work out where the best places are for protected areas, for smallholder agriculture, and for intensive food production. These photos were taken on our trip in January, where the Ethiopian Biodiversity Institute held the first workshop for this project, bringing together people from conservation, agriculture, and development to start thinking about these issues together. So hopefully it's a first step in the right direction. And the other project zooms into the local level, where we're working with Addis Ababa University and directly with farmers who live around these protected areas, aiming to improve local livelihoods by increasing the resilience of their farms to shocks. And we're doing this by implementing and testing an incentive mechanism for conserving crop diversity on farms. So this project is nearly finished, and it's been a huge success. It's been increasing agrobiodiversity on farms, and participating farmers have given us really positive feedback. And I think that's because rather than an incentive mechanism that restricts the use of, say, the forest, it's an incentive mechanism that directly benefits the part of biodiversity that these people interact with most. So to finish off and come back to the title of the talk, can we protect nature without harming people? I think the answer is not automatically and not without careful planning and context-dependent support. Better outcomes for both nature and people are possible if conservation is properly funded, adapted to local contexts, and planned alongside development, agriculture, and food security needs. I'll leave you with a few key takeaways on the slide. Thank you. Beta mama saganala.